Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Alicia Jo Rabins about her new memoir, When We're Born, We Forget Everything.
I kind of thought, what were the most spiritually transformative moments in my life? Often moments that kind of burned with like a red hot glow that I still remember today. And some of them very beautiful, some of them very cringy. And I just committed to following that kind of iron in the fire type glow.
Alicia Jo Rabins is a writer, musician, composer, performer, and Torah teacher. She has published 2 award-winning poetry collections, a collection of short personal essays called Even God Has Bad Parenting Days, and a children's book called Hallelujah, the Story of Leonard Cohen. Alicia is the creator and performer of Girls in Trouble, an indie folk song cycle about the complicated lives of biblical women. It has an accompanying curriculum and is now being made into an indie web series. She is also the creator of A Kaddish for Bernie Madoff, which began as a one-woman chamber rock opera and was adapted into an award-winning independent feature film. This song is Blackberry Spring from Alicia's fiddle album, Sugar Shack. You'll hear more of Alicia's music throughout this special episode. In our conversation, we'll talk with Alicia about the spiritual hunger she felt even as a child.
I subscribe to the theory that there are, among the different intelligences that we have as humans, one of them is spiritual. Not really something like special about me. I just think I was made with that part of the human apparatus being very much active and looking for ways to engage and understand.
And we'll discuss how she came to Girls in Trouble, her songwriting project about biblical women.
I was obviously supposed to write a master's thesis for my master's, and I am a responsible student, and I don't usually procrastinate, but I really couldn't bring myself to take these stories of biblical women that had really come to life for me and squish them down into a paper. And my advisor had this incredible idea, and he said, well, why don't you write songs about the research that you've done? And as long as you annotate them, I can probably convince the dean.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Alicia. I'm so happy to talk to you today. I just adored this book. What struck me so deeply was how it captures a spiritual journey in this most intense register, and the longing and the conviction and that like electric sense of meaning. And you just open that up so that the reader can experience that with so much vulnerability, and you can really feel it from the inside. So thank you for sharing it with us. You've been engaged in like every kind of creative pursuit, writing, music, film, etc. You've published poetry and essays and a children's book. What brought you to writing this memoir, and why now?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for those words. It is vulnerable. That's sort of my practice as an artist, is really related to vulnerability. And even though I'm really committed to it and love it and feel very grateful for that practice, it's also challenging as the regular human in me is like, what are you doing? Why are you sharing this with the world? So it just means a huge amount to hear your words. I really appreciate it. Okay. So the true story is that I came up as a poet. So that's what I was obsessed with in high school, majored in undergrad, did an MFA. I never really thought about writing any other form except poetry. I was very dedicated to writing, but very much focused on poetry. And I was at a writing conference in 2009, and I gave a poetry reading, and this agent who I had never met came up to me and said, kind of in passing, just kind of walked by and said, you know, you have a voice. You should write nonfiction. It would sell. And I was like, what? Sell writing? Because poets don't do that. It's just not part of the equation. Like the most famous poets in America have other jobs, you know? And so I was kind of like, okay, so if I'm going to write nonfiction, what will I write about? And I do a lot of teaching about biblical women and kind of text scholarship and creating art and music about stories of biblical women. And I thought, okay, well, that's sort of an area of expertise that I have. So maybe I'll write a nonfiction book about biblical women. And at this point, this is like 7 years after that initial encounter. And I sort of sat down, I kind of started to feel ready to write it. And I kind of thought, what were the most spiritually transformative moments in my life? Often moments that kind of burned with like a red hot glow that I still remember today. And some of them very beautiful, some of them very cringy. And I just committed to following that kind of iron in the fire type glow and looking back inside myself. And once I started, I just couldn't stop.
If you're someone who's drawn to thoughtful conversations about politics, culture, leadership, and Jewish identity, there's a podcast I think you'll really appreciate. It's called Identity Crisis from the Shalom Hartman Institute. Each week, host Yehuda Kurtzer brings a rare combination of moral rigor and genuine curiosity to the biggest questions facing Jewish life. Yehuda has also been a guest on the 5 Books, where we talked about his unusual upbringing as the child of a diplomat and about falling in love with 2nd century rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Yehuda sits down with a wide range of guests on his show, people like Harvard University President Alan Garber, author Sarah Hurwitz, and writer Franklin Foer, to talk through the big questions around Jewish life and identity today. What makes Identity Crisis stand out is that it doesn't rush to easy answers. Instead, it creates space for disagreement and nuance to talk about the most pressing issues of this Jewish moment, like leadership in polarized times, Israel and the Jewish people, free speech, or what responsibility looks like when values collide. If you're looking for a podcast creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life, I'd really recommend checking out Identity Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Book 1, a book that impacted your Jewish identity, Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers. You write about your childhood in a way that certainly for anyone Gen X or Gen X adjacent felt particularly resonant. So can you just tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like Jewishly growing up?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a really wonderful, loving home, amazing parents, and it was also a very culturally assimilated Jewish home. So nobody in my family had been religious or deeply involved Jewishly for at least, I would say, 3 generations, sort of like they came over from the old country and transformed into Americans. And interestingly, they continue to, raise their kids Jewish. And so both my parents are Jewish. So I kind of I just had this sense of duality of, I know that I'm Jewish. I feel this interest in it. It makes me different from everyone around me because I grew up in a very Christian suburb of Baltimore that I don't think Jews were even allowed to buy houses there, like 10 or 20 years before my parents bought their house there. And they kind of, I think, bought their house there intentionally because, they were sort of like, yeah, we don't want to be in like the Jewish neighborhood. We want to sort of just like be in a general neighborhood, which at that point meant like a Christian neighborhood, essentially Protestant, So I grew up with this sense of being different, but also, white. And I am like more olive complected. So people would often be like, what are you? And so I did have a sense both from inside and outside that I was somehow different, but also not in a definable way. And I also had a lot of spiritual hunger. And although I did have a bat mitzvah and I went to Hebrew school, it was all the way across town and really separated from the rest of my life and a very sort of tenuous form of education, with all respect to my former educators, having taught Hebrew school many times myself and knowing how hard that is. So that was sort of how I grew up. It's just sort of, 80s suburban, feeling different and not being able to really put a name on it. And of course, it wasn't just being Jewish. It's also being an artist and all kinds of other things. But Judaism was definitely a core question for me.
And you talk a little bit about that spiritual hunger, and you write about it so earnestly and authentically. I guess if you could talk a little bit more about that as a child and kind of what led you to then, we're going to talk about Pirkei Avot and like how you got from that childhood to then sitting in that room where you encountered Pirkei Avot for the first time.
I'm not the only person who has this, but I subscribe to the theory that there are, among the different intelligences that we have as humans, one of them is spiritual. And just like I'm not really a sports person and I just don't really speak that language. I love to actually move my body and work out, but I don't have that like I was never called to be part of sports. And I have a son who's really into playing sports. And I see like his just natural draw towards it. I never had that. And so that's the way that I see my spiritual hunger as a child, is like, it's not really something like special about me. I just think I was made with that part of the human apparatus being like very much active and looking for ways to engage and understand. And I think that's part of why I'm an artist. It definitely plays into my practice as an artist. And I really felt like I was an artist very young. And I think art kind of enabled me for the first 16, 17 years of my life to feel like I was able to address some of these questions of human existence, like just sort of the deepest questions of being alive. I was able to kind of deal with them through art. And I didn't even realize at that point that actually there were ways of dealing with them even more directly, not moderated through art, but through actual like spiritual texts. And so I started to understand that in high school, not really knowing that that existed in Judaism, but starting to read like Lives of the Saints and a little bit of, Buddhist philosophy, and trying to explore how different people and groups who have sought to understand what it means to be human have distilled that and passed it on. So I was really primed leading towards Pirkei Avot, which is one of the great Jewish books of that question. In college, when I kind of encountered that for the first time, I had already, I think, been looking for it without knowing it for a long time. And so it was kind of like an explosion, because the part of me that wanted to understand more about my Judaism and the part of me that just had a deep spiritual hunger to understand how to engage with being human were both opened up and addressed directly by encountering this ancient Jewish text.
So tell us about that encounter with Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers.
Yeah, so I went to Barnard because I was like a young feminist, and I was really interested in like an all-women's school and, good academics and all those things. And I really loved New York. And I had no idea before getting there that there was also this sizable Orthodox Jewish population there. I just didn't know because I wasn't in the Jewish world. So people in the Jewish world know that, but I didn't know that. So I got there. It was literally the first time I had met Orthodox Jews who I really thought of as like some kind of unicorns or something, And so as I slowly began to, I didn't have a lot of social encounters because I just wasn't in that world, but my roommate was really into indie rock, and she had a 2 a.m. radio show, and her co-DJ on the radio show happened to be this like really cool modern Orthodox young woman, sophomore, I think. And so that was the first person who was like in my room because I lived with my roommate. And I was like, oh my God, there's an Orthodox person in my room. I can like ask them. So I just started like peppering her with questions. And finally she was like, oh my God, stop. And so she told me there's this open study session every Wednesday night called Wednesday Night Learning. And it's for people who want to study Jewish texts. So why don't you just go there? And so I went there. And I was matched up with a study partner, which is the traditional Jewish way of learning text. And that study partner was this incredible young woman who I call Shira in the book, although that's not her real name, who was sort of having her first experience in the more secular world. She had transferred to Barnard because she was getting too religious for her Orthodox parents. And so they had said, you need to go somewhere that's not an Orthodox school, that's a little more worldly. So I was having sort of my first encounter with the Orthodox world. She was having her first encounter with the secular world. And she said, let's look at Pirkei Avot, because it's a great kind of basic text about ethics and what it means to live a good life. And that is how it all started.
And what is it that you took away at the time, or what has stayed with you?
You said earnest, and I know it's a, feature or bug of me being me in the world and my writing and my living. And I found these ancient texts to be earnest and wise, and like just not pretending that they weren't directly addressing some of these deep questions, such as like, if you have a huge passion for something, whether it's social justice or making art or even just being a good person, like how do we manage the desire to be perfect or fully meet that goal with the reality of our human limitations? So there's this like one beautiful sentence in Pirkei Avot that says, the work is not yours to complete, but nor are you free to desist from it, right? So it's like, it's not your job to finish it. These projects are huge human projects. Many, many, many generations, impossible amounts of people are all working together on this collaborative project. Don't think that you're going to solve it. Don't have the ego to think you're going to solve it, and don't have the perfectionism to think you're going to nail it. And at the same time, like, you have to show up and try and like do the practice. And just a simple saying like that for a sort of perfectionist overachiever with a huge passion for writing the best poetry I could, very like young, very earnest. For me, it was like, oh, I really needed to hear that. Like, I needed that wisdom of like, at once chill out and honor the practice.
Just to go back to the earnest, I think it's such a gift to be able to write with that. Anything other than that is kind of a protective shield. I just think that there's so little writing about desire, spiritual desire, that to have someone like be able to access it and then convey it in such an authentic way is really, it's special and really wonderful. And along those lines, you did have a journey from that first encounter to then ending up in studying in Yeshiva in Israel. So that was quite a journey. Can you just give us like a taste for listeners who haven't read the book yet of a little bit of what that journey was like for you?
Yeah. Well, as you may be able to tell, I really go into things full force when I get into them. It was like I got a taste and I just felt like, okay, I need to go really deep into this. I just had a lot of clarity that I needed to learn the language so that I could learn the text in the original. And I also wanted to understand the rhythm of time and ritual. I was really drawn to that. So it wasn't just the intellectual text. It was like visiting this new friend. She took me generously home to her parents' house for Rosh Hashanah. And so I was experiencing like a observant Jewish routine of time for the first time. And I felt like, oh, there's a sort of an art practice of dealing with time and managing, manipulating, appreciating, being present in time that I was really drawn to. So essentially, I ended up finding out that there's this school in Jerusalem called Pardes, where their mission is to teach everyone Torah. And so unlike many of the schools in Jerusalem, whose mission is to transform you into a fully observant Orthodox person who will then go live an Orthodox life, my experience was that Pardes wanted to give anyone who wanted to be able to study Torah the tools to study Torah. Often, college graduates all the way up to people in their 60s who are actually on some kind of spiritual or cultural journey. And so for me, it was the perfect place to learn to study Torah and live within those routines and rituals, because I could fully show up as the feminist that I was and the critical thinker that I was, and kind of learn from scratch. And I really felt accepted and really nurtured by the teachers there. And I'm still so grateful. I ended up staying for 2 years, and kind of in those 2 years went from basically knowing the Hebrew alphabet to really being able to basically open Talmud and read Talmud and beginning to learn to teach. And so it was an incredibly transformative 2 years of intense study.
Book 2, a book that impacted your Jewish identity. Reading the Women of the Bible by Tikva Freimer-Kensky. I
found this book at Broadside Books in Northampton, Massachusetts, when I was living there in my early 20s. That's where I moved after Jerusalem. And I had begun teaching kids at a little Jewish day school, and I was teaching what they called remedial Hebrew. And it was a very sweet way to learn to teach, because there was a really amazing principal who really nurtured us. It was a very small school, small community. And so I was in the early years of growing into myself as not just a Jewish practitioner, but a Jewish educator. And I also was still a writer and obsessed with books. And so I went into Broadside Books and I took it out, flipped through it, and immediately bought it. And I just found her approach to biblical women to be, it reminded me in some ways of, I had the privilege of learning from Aviva Zorenberg when I was in Jerusalem. And there's a way that like sort of really delving into the characters of the biblical characters, so delving into their emotional lives and having a kind of academic overlay. I feel like there's a very powerful kind of triumvirate that happens then, where you've got the academic analysis approach, the traditional Jewish text study and kind of just deep knowledge of how Jewish texts view this ancient, myth essentially. And then this third element of just like an emotional attention to what that character might have felt like, kind of the humor in the story as well. And I just found that incredibly powerful. And also just focusing on biblical women is, as a feminist who's always been interested in stories of women, it's a patriarchal ancient culture. And so there's sort of a leaning towards the stories of the men in the way that it's often taught. And it was really cool to flip it and be like, what if the women are at the center? And I think that book, which I reread a few times, eventually became just one of the things that kind of worked its way into my DNA and really was a deep inspiration when I started to write songs about biblical women, which began as my master's thesis for JTS when I was doing a master's in Jewish women's studies. I'm still doing that project. It's almost 20 years. I'm literally in the studio this week, not today, but the rest of the days this week, working on the 4th album of songs about biblical women. And it's become this huge part of my life and my teaching to kind of deeply consider stories of different women from Torah, looking for a place where my life or contemporary life intersects with their story and kind of the emotional heart of their story and ways in which their mythic kind of archetypes can kind of keep us company, reflect our own struggles as human instead of personal failings, and give us more of a sense of sort of emotional context. So that's become a huge and beloved project of mine.
It's an amazing project. Can you tell us a little bit, which you write about in the book, about the genesis of that project?
Yeah, I think my biggest projects start in a very subtle way. I'm actually listening to an audiobook, that Slow Productivity by Cal Newport right now. And he's talking so much about how like a lot of big ideas come not through grinding, but through giving yourself space. And for me, sometimes it comes from trying to get out of doing something else too. And so that's the case for this. So I was obviously supposed to write a master's thesis for my master's. And I am a responsible student and I don't usually procrastinate, but I really couldn't bring myself to take these stories of biblical women that had really come to life for me and squish them down into a paper. And, academics write great academic books, but I am not an academic and my academic writing is boring. And I just knew I just felt like it would be shutting the book again, a book that I had opened. So I was kind of dragging my feet, and my advisor, Rabbi Bert Vysotsky, was like, what is going on with you? You're usually not, slow to turn in your work. And I basically came to his office and explained to him what was going on. And he had this incredible idea, which was, he knew I was a musician. He had come to see me perform. And he said, well, why don't you write songs about the research that you've done? And as long as you annotate them, I can probably convince the dean to give you your master's degrees with this as your thesis. So he took me to see the dean and she said, well, do you want to continue on to a PhD? I said, no. And she said, okay, that's fine. And so my first Girls in Trouble songs, that's what I ended up naming the project, were literally 5 songs that I wrote and recorded on my little laptop in my apartment in Brooklyn about 5 of the different biblical women that I had gone deep into their stories. Often there was also some kind of relationship between the character and music, which is part of what I was focusing on in my studies.
The raven showed us how to open the ground and feed it what it grew. But all the while as we buried your brother, I was thinking of you.
And I really thought, okay, this is just my get out of jail free card for writing a thesis. And then I played them for a friend who ran a nonprofit Jewish record label called J-Dub that I was in another band called Golem that was on that label. And I said, hey, what do you think of these songs? And he actually, to my surprise, said, if you write enough to make an album, we'll put out the album. And that's when it shifted from being a way to get out of writing a master's thesis to being this kind of band and this musical educational project that has since continued to grow. And now there's an indie TV series that I'm creating based on it. And it's been kind of adapted in different ways. And it's just an absolute joy to get to be in conversation with these biblical women through art and education.
Music and the spiritual journey are these two very strong threads throughout your life. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how you see those two strands in conversation with each other? Obviously, you brought them together in this project, but beyond that, you were already in Golem.
Yeah. And Golem is still going strong and they're still amazing. I just moved to the West Coast, so I had to be replaced. One of the great fortunes of my life is that my mom was watching the Phil Donahue show, which was a talk show in the 80s when I was, 3 years old, I think. And she saw a little feature on the Phil Donahue show about the Suzuki method, where you start playing violin very young and you learn by ear, more like a language, instead of learning to read music first. She's not a musician, but she thought that seemed like a good idea. And she looked in the phone book, pre-internet, and discovered that there was a little Suzuki music school that was near our house. So she took me down. And so I started playing this very tiny violin at the age of 3 or 4. And then I just kept doing it. And so I had the great privilege of an amazing musical education without pressure, because no one wanted me to be a classical musician in my family. There was no expectation. I didn't want to be a classical musician, but I loved playing music. So I kind of had this really stellar music education. I'm so grateful to all of my teachers and to my parents. And then in college, I was introduced to fiddle music just from running into a busker on the street in Union Square, who I'm still friends with. And so he gave me some lessons in exchange for me buying him some Guinness. And I started playing old-time fiddle, like Appalachian old-time fiddle, and then eventually klezmer. And that's when I really started to feel like, oh, this is something I can do for the rest of my life, because classical music is just too refined for me. But fiddle music is so accessible. And to my absolute surprise, it became more of a professional endeavor, which I never expected.
So even before Girls in Trouble, you landed in a klezmer punk band. So how did you see that as part of your story?
Well, playing with Golem was incredible because I had been playing with mostly old-time and bluegrass type bands, but at that point I was more observant than I am now. And so I was like not playing on Friday nights and doing all these wild workarounds of like, I'll leave my stuff at the gig and I'll stay in somebody's couch 2 miles away and then I'll walk over and like play right at the moment that there's 3 stars in the sky on Saturday. And it just, no one around me was observant like that. So it was an interesting lesson in trying to hold 2 things at once. And playing klezmer, there was something very sweet about it because it felt like, well, this is really my music of like my ancestors, because I'm fully Ashkenazi and this is like the music that my great grandparents were probably listening to. But I didn't really have like people to play that with. So I would just sort of throw in a tune here or there in a show. And then I got a random email from Annette Ezekiel, now Annette Ezekiel Kogan, who's the band leader of this amazing kind of klezmer rock band Golem in New York. And they were looking for a violinist or fiddler. And I had come to New York 2 or 3 times to take lessons with Alicia Spiegels, who's this incredible klezmer fiddler whose work I love so much. And so Annette had asked Alicia Spiegels, do you know anyone? And she said, well, there's this like person up in Northampton, but I don't know. So basically Annette came up to Northampton. We played some music together on the couch and it just like clicked so beautifully. And I was also kind of ready for a change at that time. So she, offered me the job of moving to Brooklyn and being the fiddler in Golem. Not a job like it would pay for everything, but the role. And I knew I was going to have to do other work, and I certainly did. But it was an incredible way to get myself back to New York after, having gone to college there and not lived there since then. But I never stopped loving it. And to get to move back to New York as a musician and playing with this incredible, just everyone in that band is at such a high level and such great people. So it was really amazing to feel like my Jewish identity and my musical performance and the part of me that wanted to kind of be out late and be on stage and all those things, they were all all together. And there's this, kind of ancestral connection with it all that was really, really, really joyful.
And then it seems like with Girls in Trouble, you just deepened that intertwined thread.
With Girls in Trouble, I get to take my love of songwriting, take my love of Appalachian and, Southern bluegrass music, take my classical training and classical composition. So right now I'm arranging string parts for this album that I'm recording, and as well as taking my many years of Torah scholarship and focusing on women in Torah, and also the part of me that asks these spiritual questions, because when I'm writing the songs, I'm really trying to connect with the character. I'm writing the songs in the characters' voices. So it's a kind of a spiritual communion that I'm looking for with the characters and with the texts. So that's really feels like, in a way, my life's work, because it's drawing on my training as a poet to write the lyrics, and really just every part of what I've learned and done in my life.
It's incredible to find that right project that brings it all together like that.
Yeah, I highly recommend trying to get out of writing a thesis.
Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. Japanese Death Poems.
So Japanese Death Poems is a collection of what it sounds like, which is very short, often haiku poems by Zen monks or poets on the verge of death. And many of them are, centuries old. And I first encountered it in high school, and I've been kind of reading it ever since. I think, if you're serious about poetry or creative writing, it can get wrapped up in ego just necessarily. It's just one of those things. If you care about something and you're ambitious, ego gets involved, and there's no way around it. And this book, as both a writer and as a human, is like a reset every time I open it, because each one is one person about to die, leaving a few words. They're often kind of funny. Some of them are poignant. Some of them are sad. And so it's got the power of a memento mori, of that tradition of things that remind us of death, because it's so hard to just remember that our time here is temporary. We get all weighed down with details. And then as a writer, it reminds me of the sacredness of writing and sort of the purity of just being a human, putting words on a page or speaking words. And there's no thought of publication. There's no thought of self-promotion. All of that stuff just falls away when you think about this Zen monk on their deathbed saying these kind of few words as they leave the world. And I also just, that humor element is really, really important to me. And I'm always trying to hold kind of the depth and seriousness and earnestness with just how funny things can be if you let them be. Just a constant attention to the humor and levity that's woven throughout all the seriousness. And this book was a really important teacher for that too.
Given that you chose a path that was distinct from your own upbringing, I'm wondering as a parent how you balance offering a rooted tradition and a spiritual language and still leaving space for your children to find their own discovery.
Yeah. It helps that my husband's basically an atheist, and I love that about our relationship. I really love all ways of relating with the divine, including atheism, and not to project the divine onto his reality. But I think that from the get-go, I think we're trying to model for them that you have to be true to yourself. You have to find your own path. And we're trying to create a joyful Jewish experience for them that will give them support and help them know that even when we're not around, there will be community to support them and traditions to support them, while also, I would say probably once every 4 months, one of my kids will be like, what if I converted to Christianity? And I've just always been yeah, that's I want you to follow your path. And they'll try to push me and be but would you be mad? I'm I would be maybe a little sad, because I like the idea of passing down this tradition, but I'm also teaching so many people that I am passing down the tradition. And I feel most important for you as a human is to do what feels right and true to you. And I really mean that. So I think there's not a lot of pressure coming from me.
It seems like your parents gave you that space also.
They absolutely did. And I feel so bad that I'm like writing this memoir. I'm actually waiting to hear back. My mom is like currently reading it. I don't even think my dad's going to read it, but I'm just like, it's like everyone's nightmare to have a memoirist in the family. Poetry was bad enough, but at least no one really understands it, you know?
I'm not your mom, but you did a very sensitive job. It's clear that you have so much love and respect for them and vice versa. So
thank you. Yeah. I mean, it is I don't know, it's like built into the practice of writing a memoir. It's very ethically fair to tell your story. But I think what's unfair is that it like solidifies your version of your family, all the, relationships, things like that. And I feel like, gosh, I wish just everyone could be like, also, here's my experience of it, because it just doesn't quite feel fair. And yet I felt called to do it. And I tried really hard to write as, respectfully as I could. And whenever I can be the bad guy, I kind of went into this knowing like, I want myself to be, as much villain as anyone else. That's important to me.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Mother's Milk, Essays on Child Rearing, the Household, and the Making of Jewish Culture by Dina Aronoff.
It's an academic book, and I'm also finding it quite readable. It's about the transmission of Jewish culture, and really it's proposing to center kind of early childhood and the home and home rituals as a core primary modality for the creation of Jewish culture, as opposed to the way that we often look at it, which is more like Jewish texts pass down the culture, and that's kind of expressed or moderated through home life. So it's really lovely, especially like as a feminist, as a mother, as someone raising children myself, as a teacher. We sometimes think of spiritual teaching as some wise scholar instructing some acolyte, but thinking of it as like a mother caring for a baby, and that is a form of spiritual education. For the mother, certainly, but also for the baby. I think it's quite beautiful.
Book 5, the author's latest book, When We're Born, We Forget Everything, a memoir by Alicia Jo Rabins.
So much of the story is about finding the right balance for you between Judaism as a set of laws and a Judaism that really nourished your soul. And you talk about how much to invest in the rules versus the ideas that they point you towards. So can you talk a little bit more about that dichotomy and just give us a taste of what they'll find in the book?
Yeah. Well, in my experience, kind of one of the fundamental tensions or paradoxes is tradition and innovation. I'm obviously not the first person to say this, but that tension between being held by structures, but also needing to be free to be responsive and creative. It's not an answerable question. It's an ongoing balancing act in my life between existing in ritual, which is so important, and the way that ritual can also kind of like compress us sometimes and force us into corners that are not necessarily the fullest expression of who we are. I would say my spiritual journey has been sort of like growing up with very little Jewish structure, going very deep into that and feeling incredibly grateful for it, and starting this sort of pendulum ever since. And now, 25 years into the pendulum, I am at some kind of central space. And now the pendulum is absolutely still going back and forth, but it's not necessarily causing me to make huge life changes based on it. It's more internal.
I loved you had that little anecdote about being at Barnard and noticing these Orthodox young women who were standing waiting for electric doors to open on Shabbat so that they didn't initiate the doors opening themselves, and that to you was so beautiful, and that they were, just if you could tell us about that.
I was actually mystified because I was like, sometimes it'll be like cold out. It's New York in the winter. And there are these like young women just standing there outside waiting until someone else walks through the door. And then they follow them. Like, what? They're Barnard students. Like, what's going on? And I finally asked someone, and they explained that because the doors are electric and Orthodox Jews don't initiate electricity on Shabbat from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, to get into their dorm, they had to follow someone else in who had caused the doors to open. And I kind of realized later, like, oh, this is the kind of thing that annoys some people about religious ritual, because it's like, wait, that makes no sense. Someone else does it, but you can't do it. It seems very picky or, ridiculous or something. But for me, I was like, oh my gosh, like this institutional setting of these like sliding glass doors of this large dorm on Broadway that I lived in, which felt, a little bit inhuman, a little like kind of like larger than any human scale that I could quite wrap my mind around. Suddenly it just felt like, oh, it's part of something sacred, like waiting for the doors to open to walk through because it's sacred time. It just felt so magical. I mean, it kind of gave me that feeling of like being a little kid and making potions in the backyard and like being like, yeah, I know I'm just mixing oregano and baby powder and stirring it. Like on one level, I know it's not actually a potion, but there's some kind of like magical feeling about it. And I think that's the magic of ritual. And for some reason, those sliding glass doors were the things that really woke me up to that.
I love that story. And you have a similar story about music from watching Titanic, right?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So I had spent a semester abroad on a schooner. So I had just come off of like a really intense sailing experience, like at sea, which was wild. And then I was back in New York, went to go see Titanic alone. So the boat part felt very real to me. It did not feel like some abstract thing from the past. I was like, I was just on a large boat at sea for 6 weeks. And so then when of course I knew it was going to happen, but I was sort of having like a pretty emotional experience watching it sink. And as it began to sink, there were two things happening on deck that I remember. And one was that there was a string quartet that can, famously kind of continued to play as the Titanic sank. And then there was this preacher in the movie who was kind of shouting out to God to save them. And I just, in that moment, like as a lover of string quartets and playing string quartets, I felt such clarity that if it was in that state of like absolute desperation, I would not be playing the string quartet. I would be crying out to God. And at this point in my life, God was not a word I was comfortable with. I didn't have a relationship with God or the very beginnings of one, but I didn't really know what to think about it. And I just thought, okay, this was a kind of a gift of clarity of like, it's sort of like having a medical scare and then realizing it wasn't. It was sort of like I got to experience like vicariously experience a moment of extreme danger and threat, understand that what I would do is to pray, which was not a practice that I really had at that time. And so I kind of walked out of the theater and I thought like, okay, if that's where I go in those moments, if that's predictive, then I think I want to like develop a relationship with this God figure before that. Like how powerful could it be to be in conversation while not in crisis? And how might that also support me in a moment of crisis if I actually have those tools to pray? And that was a really important step on my journey towards having more of a relationship with the idea of God or the divine.
And you also write about God in poetry and being able to understand the word God differently.
Yes. And as a poetry student and practitioner, I noticed that there were certain poets like Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, who I really loved some of these religious poets, but I also, when they would write about God, my brain would sort of shut off. It was just like I didn't have a relationship with the idea of God. It just didn't make sense to me. So I would be like taking in their words. It was so beautiful. And then it would be like blank and then taking in their words. And around the Titanic time, I sort of thought, well, what if I plug in whatever that force is that I would be praying to, whether it's inside me or out there, however, whatever it is. What if I plug that into the word God, like an algebraic substitution? It's the only time I've used algebra in my adult life. And read it that way. And all of a sudden, these poems that had been kind of opaque to me just sprang to life because I was reading along and then I got to God and I felt, instead of blankness, I felt that intensity and power of whatever it is that's beyond us. And I started to be able to understand religious poetry, and not just what we think of as traditional religious poetry, but like the poetry of Emily Dickinson, the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, John Donne, T.S. Eliot, these poets that I had loved in a literary way. Suddenly their religious elements opened up to me in this gorgeous, gorgeous way.
You write in the book that you haven't seen the character you call Shira, who was your chavruta, your study partner, since you were in Israel just after college. Now you are a Torah teacher yourself. If this version of you were sitting across from her at Wednesday Night Learning, what do you think you would tell her or both of you about, how to approach the study?
That's such a kind and thoughtful question. I think my approach to teaching has a lot to do with listening. I mean, I am so grateful for her teaching of me. It was such loving pedagogy. We just studied it in English, even though she knew the Hebrew, but I didn't. And so we talked about these deep questions. She was happy to have me ask her anything. She would ask me questions about secular life. So I think it was a really successful chavruta, like study partnership. It was really boundaried. It wasn't like we became best friends and hung out all the time. It was like an encounter of two people from different worlds who really had this like lovely cultural exchange. So I think if I were to be me now revisiting, I would just probably listen, and maybe I'd push back a little bit on what one or the other of us said. But I think exactly what needed to happen for me happened in those conversations. I'm so grateful. It could have gone differently. She could have presented things in a way that didn't leave room for my questions and my experience, and maybe my life would have taken a really different, route. So I'm just so grateful to her.
And what feels most meaningful to you about your Jewish identity now?
Well, I'm actually on a path to become independently ordained as a rabbi in a few months. I've been working towards for a couple of years with 3 rabbi mentors who I've known for many, many years. And it's just incredible how infinite the journey of learning is. And I think getting to be like a parent of currently middle schoolers and seeing how Judaism plays into that relationship and supports it, and then being a teacher to all these unaffiliated families and seeing how that works in the world and feeling like the joy in that connection, and then being guided by my 3 mentors over the last few years and really taking classes and actively continuing to build my own skills as a rabbi. The 3 of those together just it's just such an infinite practice. And I'm so grateful for how much it offers. And I'm so grateful for the room within it to be flexible. I was just studying, I do a lot of B'nai Mitzvah preparation for unaffiliated families. And I usually just work with the young student, but in this case, it's a mother who never had a bat mitzvah and her daughter. And I'm actually working with them together over Zoom. Is how I usually teach. And we looked at the text from Pirkei Avot where one of the rabbis says, I grew up at the feet of the sages and I found nothing better in life for a person than to shut up. Like basically shut their mouth, be quiet. And I hadn't read that in a while. I was so delighted because I thought, wow, this is like a total critique of the entire institution of rabbinic analysis and talking and passing down the oral tradition. And it's in the oral tradition. That's why we have it. But it's kind of this like dissident, son of a rabbi who's like, I've been listening to this all my life and I think silence is better than any of it. And then he says, and action is always greater than study. And so he's just kind of schooling them in a way of like, you think all this talk and all these texts and all these words are so important, but silence and action is what's important. And the fact that those opposing viewpoints are in there and that it just makes me feel like we can all really show up fully as ourselves, and whatever we need, there's going to be something in there that resonates with it and supports it, even if it's taking time away from the tradition. It's not like then we can't come back to it. And I'm grateful for that space.
I think that capaciousness, that, the infinite that you're talking about is so much what I got from your book of just being able to enjoy how someone else experienced their religious quest, that spiritual journey. And I felt so grateful to be able to just shut up and listen to you. So
it's such an honor to be read, truly. I mean, I'm so grateful to you for reading it and getting it. And I'm so glad that it meant something to you.
Thank you so much for being here today.
It's a joy.
Well, I went down to the river so wide. Satan was standing on the other side. He said to me, look and see. I saw you with our only child, with a knife in your hand and your while on the mountain top, and then the vision stopped.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Alicia Jo Rabins talking about her book, When We're Born, We Forget Everything.
My love, what have you done? And where have you taken my only son? Sometimes
You're listening to River So Wide, a song about the biblical Sarah from the Girls in Trouble album, Open the Ground. You can find all of Alicia's music and her new book on our website and in our show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or to our email team@5bookspod.org. And if you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and more great book recommendations directly to your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin, who made this episode extra special with all the music. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council, and thank you to Felicia Herman and David Benor.
the sun is in the sky, but it's dark inside my head.